welcome to another episode of the Clean Palette Podcast. I'm your host, Justice Johnson. Today, we peel back the paint and reveal the clean palette on the origins of painting. This art medium has been thriving throughout the ages, yet before we can discuss how painting has evolved and grown over the years, we must first talk about what paint is in the first place. Paints as you know them today are formed in three parts. You have your pigment or the coloring agent, the binder, which is what holds the pigment in place until it is used, and then you have your solvent, which helps the flow of the painting and how it is applied. The solvent is typically added into the paint using a brush. Common solvents are oil and water. Once the solvent evaporates, then your paint is set onto the surface which is desired by said artist. Going back as far as 100,000 years ago within the Blombos Caves on the southern Cape coastline, approximately 300 kilometers east of Cape Town, is where the very first art supplies were found. Hollowed out abalone shells filled with ground ochre and charcoal sat on the floor. These supplies were discovered in the cave, yet there were no paintings to go with them. The first known painting was dated back 40,000 years ago on cave walls, depicting hunters and herders from tribes and locations in Europe, Australia, and Indonesia. These paintings are suspected to be made by Neanderthals rather than modern-day humans by Professor José Luis Centurión at the University of Cordoba in Spain. Early pigments were created by using easy-to-find materials. These artworks of the past used blood, tree sap, berries, and dried plant roots, and many other materials that were at their fingertips. Such pigments were then added to solvents that even the most eccentric artists of today would find to be gross or grotesque. Urine, saliva, and animal fats would help the artists of the past spread the paint onto their surface of choice. To apply the gross mixture, they would either use their hands, a makeshift brush, or they would hollow out animal bones and blow them through in an airbrush fashion. Today, there are 6 common painting media. In no particular order, there are acrylic, watercolor, oil, tempera, fresco, and caustic. When you think about Egyptian wall paintings, then you will be talking about tempera. Tempera mixes pigment with egg yolk, and they burst the membrane and just use the egg yolk, and they use the egg yolk as the binder. The mixture is then thinned out and released with water later on. Tempera is applied in several layers called glazes. These glazes are stacked on top of each other in a cross-hatching method. This medium is known for its precision and fine detail. Its precise nature is why many used it to depict religious figures in early Christianity. Tempera was the primary painting method until oil paintings became popular in the 16th century. Yet, it was not until the 20th century that it had a real revival in more contemporary artworks. This was due to the federal government's effort to fund more artists during the Great Depression. These commissioned artists would look to former artworks and art methods for inspiration for their work. The popular science fiction book Dune, written by Frank Herbert, was created in the form of tempera by American illustrator John Shaner. Another medium that made a 20th century return was encaustic painting. By mixing a pigment with warm beeswax, encaustic paintings would be spread over a supported surface. The term encaustic dates back to ancient Greece. Encaustic derives from the Greek term enkaustikos, which translates to burn in. The paint, like tempera, is used in several layers over top of each other. This layering gives it a great depth and has a nice luminous quality. Encaustic was used in Egypt during the mummification process as well. And it was also used on the walls. The paint would allow for realistic looking faces, so it would be used on top of the sarcophagus. And in the Middle Ages, painters used other mediums instead of encaustic so that they wouldn't have to frequently heat up the paint for every painting. The popularity declined dramatically after that. However, in the 18th century, archaeologists began to look deeper into the process of this very strange and unique method. A real resurgence occurred in recent years due to the popularity of electric irons, hot plates, and other commonly found heating tools. And they would use some of the surfaces that you could just easily find, some of which would be wood, paper, and pottery. Its luminous quality and depth brought many contemporary artists flocking to this ancient method. Our last ancient method is fresco. Fresco means fresh in Italian. Unlike most painting styles, true fresco does not require a binder. It is a pigment mixed with water alone and placed directly onto thin layers of wet plaster. The wet plaster is then applied to walls, and this method is primarily done on plaster walls and ceilings. There are three types of fresco. There is true fresco, there is dry fresco, and then there is medium fresco. True fresco does not require a binder and is used on wet plaster. The pigment soaks into the plaster, and then as it is applied, you can really see the colors coming through. The dry fresco is done on dry plaster, as the name would say, but that type of fresco does require a binder, and this fresco would either use egg yolk or glue. And then mezzo fresco or medium fresco would use a semi-dry plaster, which the pigment would only partially absorb into the plaster. The Italian Renaissance is known for its beautiful fresco. The Sistine Chapel ceiling done by Michelangelo in the Vatican was made with true fresco. Another popular work that you most likely have seen is the Last Supper done by Leonardo da Vinci. This is done with dry fresco. A more modern fresco finished in 1933 may sound familiar to my Michigan listeners. The Detroit Industry murals done by Diego Rivera are held in the Detroit Institute of Arts. It is a 27 piece of work, and it was done between 1932 to 1933, and the practice of creating frescoes was brought back in the 20th century with the Mexican mural movement. Frescoes lost popularity, like many of the other mediums that we talked about, due to oil paintings joining the scene. Oil painting was thought to be developed in the 15th century by German artist Jan van Eyck. The famous painter mixed linseed oil and various other nut oils with pigments. In 2008, it was discovered that the medium dates all the way back to the 7th century in Afghanistan. This paint is known for its long drying time, which allows for amazing blends of colors and shading. These colors are then put onto canvas. It is also a very versatile paint. Oil paints can be put on in thick globs or watered down and almost used like glazes. It is all really dependent on the artist's choice, and that is why a lot of artists choose it. They have so much variety that they can do and so many different combinations of color and dimension that really allowed for great innovation within the painting field. While many artists use paintbrushes to apply oil, some may choose to use palette knives or rags. These tools are typically applied onto canvas. Canvas, if you do not know, is made from linen, which is way less expensive than what some would use. Some would use wood or even cotton before, which is highly expensive. Unlike other mediums, oil paints do not dry due to evaporation of water. They actually oxidate. So this process can take any time between a few days up to typically 2 weeks. Some of the best works, in my opinion, are done with oil, from Starry Nights by Vincent van Gogh to The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali. The next medium we will be discussing may be the first medium that you used when it comes to painting: watercolor. Watercolor paints contain a pigment and a binder typically made of gum arabic, which is water-soluble. This water-soluble compound is produced from the sap of trees. Watercolor paints are very sensitive in nature. Many watercolor works give off a very soft or muted feel, yet they can also give off quite a bit of vibrance if you layer them accordingly. This medium became very popular in the late 1700s alongside the production of woven paper. There are two main techniques when it comes to watercolor. There is wet and wet, and then there's also dry brush. Wet and wet refers to using more water and letting the colors blend into one another with your brush. It is known for its soft lines and very soft transitions. The other method, as you could probably imagine, dry brush, doesn't use as much water. It uses less to very little water, and the water really only sits on top of the paper at that point, which makes for a much more rough and textured line, and it really just sits on the paper and you can see the brush strokes. The last medium I would like to cover today is the medium that I use personally, which is acrylic. Acrylic paints were developed in the 50s, and it was a substitute for oil paints. These pigments are floating in an acrylic polymer emulsion binder. Water is usually used as the solvent, yet once the water dries, the acrylic paints won't allow water to ruin it afterwards. Acrylic paints will have a similar color, longevity, and body without the toxic nature or the price. Anyone that has been to a paint supply shop has probably looked at the prices in comparison from acrylic to oil, and personally that is why I chose to use acrylic. The price point steered me far away from using oils, especially as a first-time painter. It is very, very hard to replicate colors once they dry, and that is one downside to acrylic because it dries so quickly. Some famous acrylic artworks that you may know are done by Andy Warhol, Jackson Pollock, and David Hockney. And all of these mediums that we have talked about today make fantastic art and are beloved by so many people. And I would just like to know what medium you use personally, or what medium is your favorite to look at, whether it be to use, to watch, how it feels in your hand. I would love to know in the comments down below, or if this is on Spotify or Apple, which you can't leave a comment, go to the Clean Palette, at Clean Palette Podcast on Instagram, and either DM me or I will make a post specifically for this episode and let me know what kind of art you like to make. Who are some of your favorite painters? And if you would like to see my own work, maybe I could be your next favorite artist. Go to my art page at Justice Tries. And make sure that if you are new to the channel, you subscribe so you get the latest episode of every podcast that I record. I will try to drop them every Monday to start your week off with some art. But until next week, stay creative.